Hello everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you become a literary expert. So in today's video, we are analysing Hamlet's "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt" soliloquy, which appears in Act 1, Scene 2 of the play. In this moment, Hamlet is responding to his mother, Queen Gertrude, and his uncle and now stepfather, King Claudius, who are convincing him to get over the grief of his late father's death and to redirect his energies towards his duties as the Prince of Denmark. Hamlet, however, remains deeply distraught, not just about his father's passing, but also the fact that his mother would be so quick to remarry, and out of all people, to his uncle. Hamlet finds this distasteful and incestuous, which is a descriptor that both he himself and his father's ghost uses to allude to Gertrude and Claudius's union. This soliloquy marks a key psychological moment in the play, because it provides early insights into Hamlet's character, specifically into Hamlet's tendency towards emotional, circular philosophizing as opposed to rational, productive introspection, as well as Hamlet's prejudices towards relationship and women. And these points are exactly what I'll be diving into for the rest of this video. So if that sounds good to you, join me and let's dive straight into it. Now, at this point in the play, Hamlet's emotions are a complex fusion, veering from disappointment and despair to indignation and bitterness, buttressed by an underlying current of deep sadness. There's a sense of frantic helplessness as well, as the prince struggles to comprehend how on earth his mother would be able to bring herself to be married with my uncle, my father's brother, when his father is but 2 months dead. Nay, not so much, not 2, a little month within a month. Now, his haphazard, inconsistent references to the time frame in which Gertrude had married Claudius reflects his chaotic state of mind, paralysed by disbelief and anguish over his mother's over-hasty marriage, which is actually a phrase that Gertrude herself uses later on in the play. Now, this linguistic expression of temporal disruption is matched by the rhythmic fluctuation of clipped and enjambed phrases here, the impact of which is reinforced by the frequent interruptions of Hamlet's speech flow. Now, to illustrate, take a look at this moment below. But 2 months dead. Nay, not so much. Not 2. So excellent a king that was, to this, Hyperion to a satyr. So loving to my mother that he might not beteem the winds of heaven visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth! Must I remember? And note the sharp, arrested throbbing of the phrase, that was, to this, Hyperion to a satyr, versus the spillover enjambed statement of so loving to my mother that, etc., visit her face too roughly. Now, the short clauses suggest the fleeting nature of Gertrude's love, while the enjambed clauses dramatizes the enduring affection of his late father for his wife. The messy flow of Hamlet's thought here is enacted through Shakespeare's use of aposiopesis, which is the rhetorical device of breaking off midway in speech and abruptly pivoting to another topic. So in this snippet alone, we see that Hamlet careens from judging his mother's conduct to lamenting his father's loss to agonizing over his mind's obsessive replaying and recollection of his parents' relationship. As Hamlet's speech progresses, his mental chaos intensifies to reveal that he's not only angered by his mother's cold detachment from her first marriage, but also disillusioned with women in general as being morally compromised, fickle, and frail. As he exclaims, by what it fed on, and yet within a month, let me not think on it. Frailty, thy name is woman. A little month, or ere those shoes were old with which she followed my poor father's body, like Niobe or tears. Why she, even she! Oh, God! The personification of frailty as woman smacks of a medieval morality play convention, which is to feature personified concepts like good, evil, greed as whole persons, and to have actors embody them in a one-dimensional archetypal fashion. So we see Hamlet's inner turmoil reflected in his self-conscious resistance to the thought of his mother remarrying so quickly, when he says, "Let me not think on it," only for his mind to gravitate immediately towards the subject matter that he so tries to avoid. This, by the way, is an example of paralypsis, which is the technique of bringing up a topic that the speaker claims should not be mentioned. This frenetic, schizophrenic pattern of suppress and obsess suggests that Hamlet struggles to reconcile how Gertrude could both feel genuine grief over her first husband's death and yet also demonstrate the cold political pragmatism of marrying her brother-in-law so quickly. By the way, guys, if you find this video helpful so far, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my top grade lit study content going forward. I'd also encourage you to check out my membership program by clicking the join button below if you want exclusive access to members only study content and make special video requests. I'll see you there. The allusion to Gertrude being like Niobe, all tears when she grieved late King Hamlet's death is ironic, if not also a mischaracterization and misunderstanding of his mother, because Niobe responded to the death of her husband and children by weeping non-stop, so much so that the gods turned her into a stone as a way to mitigate her suffering. But Gertrude is no such victim of circumstance. Instead, she is a stoic pragmatist who recognizes that as Queen of Denmark, her political duty precedes her personal desires. And if duty requires her to marry Claudius to ensure the continuity and stability of her state, then her grief, however deep or shallow it may be, becomes a secondary consideration. This also reveals an interesting marked contrast between the mother and the son, setting Gertrude's rational calculus sharply against Hamlet's emotional reactivity. In this speech, we see that Hamlet is just as bothered by his mother's seeming emotional coldness as he is by what he perceives as her moral weakness. His outrage over her incestuous marriage is borne out by the metaphor of "'tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed," where Hamlet compares the new Danish state with Claudius and Gertrude at the helm to an abandoned, neglected garden that is now consumed by rotten overgrowth, as things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. Now, it's possible to read this as a subtle allusion to the Garden of Eden, with the snake's infiltration causing Adam and Eve's fall being a parallel to Claudius's pernicious intrusion to the late King Hamlet and Gertrude's relationship. Given that Eve was the one to have first taken the snake's bait to taste the forbidden fruit, this would fit with Hamlet's perception of Gertrude as Eve's moral fallenness. Hamlet's moralistic framing of his mother becomes more apparent with his "frailty, thy name is woman" comment, before building up to a point of intense anguish towards the end of his speech, when the prince exclaims, "Ere yet the salt of most unrighteous tears had left the flushing in her gold eyes, she married. Oh, most wicked speed, to post with such dexterity to incestuous sheets." Here, Hamlet paints his mother in a deeply unflattering light, as conveyed through the hyperbolic and damning tone of "most unrighteous tears" and "most wicked speed." The phrases "unrighteous tears," "wicked speed," and "incestuous sheets" are also examples of hyperlage or transferred epithet, which is the rhetorical device that uses an adjective to describe an object that's closely associated with the subject, and the subject is usually a person, which creates a bit of a personifying effect. So for instance here, it's not Gertrude's tears per se that are so unrighteous, of course, but Gertrude's crying over her late husband's death and yet so quickly getting over it that Hamlet deems unrighteous or immoral. The fact that she got over it quickly is characterized as wicked speed, and her swift marriage to his uncle Claudius is framed as an act of incestuous sheets, which is actually also an example of metonymy, with sheets being a stand-in reference for the act of sexual consummation. As always, the point is to focus on what the hyperlage and metonymy reveal about Hamlet's characterization, right? So first, consider the nature of hyperlage. Taking clues from its name, transferred epithet. So transferred, right? So it shifts the attribution of an adjective from the subject to the associated object. And this act of shifting, transferring, parallels Hamlet's psychological impulse of shifting the entire burden of his grief over late Hamlet's death onto Gertrude's single action of remarrying Claudius. A literal shift is also a slanted movement, and the idea of prejudice could also be understood as a slanted, distorted view. So this further reinforces the impression that Hamlet may be judging his mother through biased, slanted lenses, fueled more by his own emotional dysregulation and frustration rather than a level-headed, objective evaluation of the situation. Now, a final point to consider is the Oedipus complex and how useful it is for us to form a robust interpretation of Hamlet and his mother's relationship. Now, the Oedipus complex is a Freudian concept which suggests that men develop a subconscious sexual attachment to their mothers from a young age, while they see their fathers as a permanent threat for their mother's affection and attention. Now, lots of scholarly analysis out there has been written on Hamlet's obsession with Gertrude's remarriage as a kind of Oedipal possessiveness, which seems a bit weird because Hamlet doesn't see his father, but his uncle as a rival for his mother's affection. And that's really not so much Oedipal as it is probably more just filial and loyal. But in any case, I'd caution against applying the Oedipal framework to Hamlet's attitude towards his mother in any way, because that might misplace the focus of his motivations. Rather than being upset about Gertrude's remarriage per se, I would argue that what Hamlet is really most upset about is what his mother's remarriage has done to himself, his consciousness, which is to introduce a rupture of moral categories that he had previously seen in rigid black versus white, right versus wrong terms. Hamlet's moralizing inclination, as I mentioned, is reflected in those words unrighteous, wicked, incestuous. So what the sort of diction reveals is that Hamlet has a really hard time sitting with or reconciling moral ambiguities. And it is this very difficulty which I think underlies his deep unhappiness with Gertrude, and not so much the ostensible act of Gertrude having remarried Claudius, despite what his speech or outward appearances may suggest. And there you go, guys. That is my analysis of Hamlet's emotions and perceptions towards his mother in this "oh, that this too solid flesh would melt" soliloquy, which is arguably, as I mentioned, one of his most important speeches in the play. So I hope my interpretation has given you refreshing insights and, of course, inspired you to look at Hamlet and Gertrude's complex relationship in a new and enhanced way. For your next video, I recommend that you watch my analysis on what else but Hamlet's most famous soliloquy, "To be or not to be," which is probably also the most famous passage in all of English literature. You can check that out right here. Click the join button below if you want to be part of my membership program so that you can get personalized essay feedback, make exclusive video requests, and access members-only content. Please hit the thumbs up button below if you found this video useful in any way, so that I'll be encouraged to keep making these weekly study videos for you and other passionate learners all around the world. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel so you never miss out on my weekly study videos on English Lit. And I will see you, as always, in the next one. Bye!